Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coastal Insights. I am your host, Emily. I'm broadcasting from Squamish territory, and this is my co-host.
What's up, everyone? I'm Arian, broadcasting from the unceded territory of the Beecher Bay First Nation.
All right. So, what's going on? Well, this is a show called Coastal Insights, and this is episode 5 of season 3. And the theme this season is hope, equity, and advocacy. This season features, as the title suggests, hope, equity, and advocacy in a world changed by, you guessed it, the COVID-19 pandemic. The episode we're doing today is about Indigenous stewardship. So, the challenges of climate change mean that decisions need to be based in science and with consideration for generations, something Indigenous people have always done and have done really well. Innovative strategies in sustainability and conservation at the forefront must come from an understanding of wisdom of Indigenous peoples and based on a holistic worldview, connection to nature, and experience of living off the land since time immemorial. Today, we're exploring the dark history of colonialism in BC and the enduring colonial policies and systemic discrimination that are maintaining significant social inequities. We're also going to be talking to our guests about how their communities and nations are creating the foundation for change based on Indigenous ways of being. Arian's going to talk about the partnerships of this program now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily, for giving a brief introduction to the season and the episode. So, hello, everyone. This season is a partnership between Raincoast Conservation Foundation and Take a Stand Youth for Conservation. Raincoast is a group of humans, researchers, scientists, and conservationists based on Wasanich territory who are doing incredible work to confront the problems facing the diverse ecosystems of our province. Raincoast does this through their mission to investigate, inform, and inspire. Alongside them this season is Take a Stand, an organization that I'm proud to be a part of. And whose goals are much like Raincoast's in the principle of fostering an informed community. What I really appreciate about Take a Stand is their focus on motivating and empowering youth to protect the environment through art, film, and youth-driven actions. Thank you to both Raincoast Conservation Foundation and Take a Stand Youth for Conservation for making Coastal Insights Season 3 possible. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our guest this episode, Colin Sutherland-Wilson. He is from the Anspajach village and was born into the Fireweed clan of the Gitxsan Nation in northwest BC. Colin has been an Indigenous Studies and Environmental Studies student at UVic, but near the end of his studies needed to attend to the highest authority within Gitxsan society, which is based on a hereditary system of governance. This led him to his commitments to helping his neighbors, the Wet'suwet'en, to protect their lands. As the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan Nation have been allies throughout history. As part of this, Colin brought provincial and national awareness via All Eyes on Wet'suwet'en and developed the News Untitled column in the Martlet to pressure UVic to address the injustices committed against the Wet'suwet'en, Unistuwet'en, and Gimitin peoples. Colin currently serves as a director at large on the University of Victoria Student Society Board. Last year, he needed to take a stand to protect his nation's territory from logging. Colin fully stands by his Gitxsan teachings and that each individual within the nation holds a timeless responsibility to protect the lands to which they belong. He has spoken on the dark history of colonialism in BC and Canada and the enduring colonial policies and systemic discrimination that are maintaining significant social inequities. Yet, Colin's messages for the future generate hope and provide the foundation for positive change based on Indigenous ways of being. Without further ado, here is Colin Sutherland-Wilson. Colin, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and also about Gitxsan territory for viewers who may not be familiar?
Of course. So, as was mentioned before, my name is Colin. I am from the Gitxsan Nation of the Gitluhlumhetwit House, which is a house of the Fireweed clan. And basically, ever since I left UVic, I came back home. I spent a lot of time with the Luxamasu clan on Wet'suwet'en territory, and then pressingly, I had to address the logging that was happening on my own family's territory. So that was a shift from solidarity action to addressing, one of the longest ongoing issues on Gitxsan territory, which is the unlawful theft of our resources without the consent of our people. So that's been the focus. And Yeah, the Giksan territory, just to explain a bit more about who I am and where I come from. So the Giksan means the people of the River of Mist. And so Git is always a prefix you'll see in front of village names and our nation within the Giksan people, because that means the people of. And Xian is the name of our river, the Skina. And so just for example, villages like Gitwangach is the people of the Rabbit Hill, and Gittenmachs, the people who fish by torchlight. And so you'll see that very commonly in Giksan territory. And our territory is located on the inland of the north coast of British Columbia, so-called British Columbia, and features a wide range of different ecosystems, because we're essentially at the intersection of the coastal ecosystem, the Arctic ecosystem, and the northern interior. And so we have a wide range of flora and fauna across our homeland, and as a result of this balance between these three ecosystems, quite a range of very sensitive and rare habitats that we have been trying to protect for a long time, and which is also a big part of why we've stopped logging, because we have very rare coastal lichens that rarely appear on the interior, that we have up in our mountains, that I very much suspect are a holdout from the last ice age. We have a lot of species we're trying to protect, and within recent Giksan history, we've had the caribou completely extirpated from our homeland, which dealt a huge blow to our people. So we're still recovering from that, and we do have strategies in place to work on the regeneration of our homeland and territory. And just a final note on the Giksan, we're very politically active people. The Delgamuukh Gistewe court case was initiated by our people, as well as the Wet'suwet'en people. And even going as far back as 1910, we have documented evidence of our hereditary chiefs approaching the crown, even citing the Canadian law, which in this case was the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that was issued by, I believe, King George III. And they were citing this law because that law in particular became the cornerstone of the Delgamuukh court case, and it also became the cornerstone of our strategy to hold the Canadian colony to accountability, because this law essentially says that land title cannot be transferred without a due process, that there must be a treaty or something along those lines involved, an agreement, like land transfer through agreement. And this is something that's never happened in the vast majority of British Columbia. And so the Giksan legal strategy when dealing with colonial matters has always been to hold them to their own laws. And yet we've seen time and time again that British Columbia, Canada, their rule of law it's a shaky thing, if at that. And even despite this being all in the books, this being a foundational part of Canadian law enshrined within the highest law within Canada, Supreme Court case law, something as simple as the right to consent, the right to the fact, not the right, the fact that we still have the full title to our territory, which has never been extinguished, which British Columbia never had the ability to extinguish. These still do not come into play, and we still face the exact same repression as if, we were any other domestic minority within the Canadian state, as if we had no laws of our own, as if we had no arguments or legal position to challenge the ongoing infringement of our laws and rights. And so till this day, over 100 years later, over 100 years since we initially approached the Crown citing their own laws, we've had very little change in the overall situation, despite UNDRIP, despite TRC, despite the rhetoric of reconciliation. We still must fight to remain Giksan.
Thank you. I think like something you touched on there is something that I've witnessed, is that Indigenous governance and Indigenous systems of governance seem to have always, in my experience, have always had a very diplomatic, very calm, very like this is just common sense sort of approach when trying to deal with colonial governments who really don't see like matters in the same way. Like the way the Canadian government is behaving towards Indigenous people is illogical. Like you said, they're going against their own laws. They're going against what they say they're going to do. Like the nation to nation talks that they're promising aren't occurring, right? They're still treating the Indigenous nations like they're lesser than when they are just as great and have been there for for way longer than the Canadian government has. I know that the Gitxsan Nation has very close ties with the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your two nations communicate and negotiate with each other, and how that's different from how, say, the Canadian government is trying or failing to negotiate with you.
Yeah, I think the Giksan Wet'suwet'en relationship, our alliance, is probably one of the best case studies available of how two distinct cultures and peoples can, interact with one another and support one another without the need of forced assimilation, which is a big lesson that Canada can definitely learn, because our two nations, we've been in alliance together for thousands of years at this point. We have detailed histories of when we first encountered one another and how that relationship grew. As my father, we Mughals, put it, this alliance, in large part, was to act as a deterrent. If you attack the Giksan Nation, then you would face retribution from the Giksan and Wet'suwet'en people, and vice versa. If you attack the Wet'suwet'en people, you would have Giksan down there supporting them. And so that relationship fundamentally still holds true to this day. And there's a huge reason why you will see lots of Giksan people, supporting in all aspects the front line down with the Wet'suwet'en, struggle against Coastal GasLink in the province there, and vice versa. There are many Wet'suwet'en people who always come up to help with the Giksan, whether it's our logging blockade on the territories or even at the CN rail tracks over many iterations of those blockades in the past few years. And I think there's other parts of that history too, which are very interesting, including the house-based culture that we come from, because in the Northwest Coast we have a very unique system of governance, a very ancient system of governance that is quite complex, that I think is often the media outlets fail to translate this, in a meaningful way for the Canadian public to actually understand who we are, what we're about, what our laws are, and essentially why we are doing the actions that we're doing. And so the Giksan and Wet'suwet'en are a part of this sphere of the house-based political systems of the Northwest Coast. And through that, like, there are many links of intermarriage, of Giksan and Wet'suwet'en peoples, transferring names or migrating from one territory to the other, and picking up the local language. And so at this point, there are so many strands connecting us, and yet, we still have our distinct languages. We have many aspects of our culture distinct, our distinct territories, and the utmost respect for one another's autonomy.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's like Yeah, you're saying two very distinct cultures, which I think a lot of settlers don't understand, that every indigenous nation is a separate nation with its own culture. So you have the Gitxsan nation and the Wet'suwet'en nation, two distinct cultures with some similarities but distinct nonetheless. And then you have them able to interact and protect each other and support each other throughout millennia, versus when it comes to the Canadian colonial government, it's always been a process of trying to suppress one nation or undermine one nation so they can get their way. One way they have sort of done this, or a tactic that the Canadian government has used, based on my understanding, in order to sort of get what they want from Indigenous nations, is they set up sort of the council system. I know you have like the hereditary chiefs, which is your traditional form of governance, and then there's also councils, which the Canadian government uses to communicate with the nation. I was wondering, could you explain what those two systems are, the hereditary chiefs and the council systems, to our viewers, and talk a little bit about its impact in your communities?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I might have to draw upon a little bit of the history prior to band councils as well, because we have to look at originally the 1957 Act, which was the act for the gradual assimilation or the gradual civilization of Native people. And this was ultimately the cornerstone of a lot of the gender-based membership rights and the enfranchisement of our people in the attempt to remove our distinct status and assimilate us within the Canadian public. And this later got wrapped in to the Indian Act of 1876. And this was where we first saw the, I guess I would say, very, what's the word, but just sweeping legislation that was put upon all of the distinct peoples across Canada in an attempt to homogenize the law. And at this time there was many complex, economic, military relationships that existed, between different Native peoples and the crown. And this was the big turning point where it's okay, we're no longer allies. This is no longer a treaty relationship. But now, like, you are ultimately a subject to the state in this brutal paternalistic relationship where we're going to be confining you to reserves and pulling you in. So this was a very big turning point in Canadian policy. And this got even more severe in 1880 when we had the potlatch ban, which essentially meant we could not gather or organize politically. Like, there was a limit on Native people, in numbers greater than 3 coming together. That would be a criminal act. And essentially this forced all of our governments underground. This forced us into hiding. This led to what we call colloquially in Gitxsan territory the Prohibition era. And all of us here have had family members, have had ancestors who were arrested, were raided by the RCMP, were many of them even lost their lives in this era, specifically due to police violence in this era. And yeah, this was kind of a reign of terror on our people. I would call this, the very classic terrorism, repression, trying to force us to completely relinquish, our identity, because this was all a part of the wider genocidal policies that existed. When you hear the words gradual civilization of Indian people, that's genocide. That's their attempt to completely erase our social identity from history, to erase anyone who has that collective origin, in this case of Gitxsan territory, to erase us from history and to assimilate us within the Canadian society. And, we saw this with the residential schools. We saw this with, a whole host of violent colonial policies that repressed our land, repressed our culture, repressed our language, repressed our governance, and essentially, forced many aspects of our culture into hiding until it was repealed in the 1950s. And this is not to say, like, in the meantime, like, we fought this across the board in, like I mentioned, in 1910, like, we were citing colonial law to fight the colonizers. And then within that same era, there was blockades happening here in Kispiox. Then over in Kitwanga, they were stopping surveyors at gunpoint. And it was, in the meantime, like across Giksan and Wet'suwet'en territories, we had a huge influx of settler vigilantism at the same time, villages, homes, cabins being burnt down, which led to a lot of conflict. And as we can see across the board in British Columbia history, it is always the conflict between the settlers and the local governments that initiates the raids by the RCMP. Like, that's always the pretext for the enforcement of colonial law, which they come in essentially under the guise of protecting, their citizens, the citizens which in many cases should not have been, going into the territories of entirely other nations and committing, arson or vigilante acts. And so, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, that strategy, because we could see that play out from Tsilhqot'in all the way up the coast. And I think many people often have questions. Okay, so what was the turning point there? Like, how was it that, RCMP enforcement specifically became the de facto means of, I guess, how did that become the political relationship? How did that authority become imposed on our territories? And there's, in my opinion, a very set strategy, if you look at it historically, of how this happens. But just moving on with the Indian Act. So in the 1920s, we saw a lot of very violent enforcement of the Indian Act and the potlatch ban, which, in our territories look like a lot of raids, similar to the raids that are happening on Innistoten today and the Gidim Den, into our feast halls and into our places of gathering, of governance. And at the same time, we also had a lot of political organizing, including like the Allied tribes of British Columbia, early 1900s, a lot of people who were trying to bring land claims to the forefront, a lot of different nations that were working together to raise funds, to talk with lawyers, to navigate all the legal processes at the time, to actually make land claims a case within the Canadian courts in the 1910s, 1920s. And as a result of this, the Indian Act was amended, which made it a criminal act to raise money for land claims. And so with a simple amendment, they completely shut off all of the legal pathways that we had for justice at the time, kind of in the midst of intense police repression across all of our communities out east. We even see very clear examples of this with, the forced dispossession of a lot of the Iroquois Confederacy governance halls, the burning of their wampums, the burning of their documents, funds, evidence, the confiscation of their funds, and the imposition of band councils with armed security by the RCMP. And so this whole era, I think the 1920s, is very important to understand, okay, how did this entirely foreign governance model get imposed on our people? And as usual, the answer is violently. And so the band council is subservient to the federal government. It's very dependent on the federal government. All of its funds, all of its jurisdiction comes from the federal government. The band council does not own any land, or an Indian band does not own any land, because it's all crown land. Under Canadian legislation, we are allowed to exist here at the pleasure of the crown. So even myself, on what is called Kispiox Reserve Number 1 right now, this home that my father built with his hands, I technically do not own this. I have a certificate of possession that says I can stay here, but this is owned by the crown. I cannot, fund any business endeavors, use it as collateral. This does not count, as an asset. Like, simply put, like, I'm under Canadian law, I'm just squatting on the Queen's, one of the Queen's millions of cabins across these territories, and it's a hugely flawed process. But getting back to the band council, so the band council is essentially, I'll explain it. It's akin to a municipality that regulates local affairs within the boundaries of the reserve. And just for context, the reserve on Gitxsan territory may be between 3 to 4% of the entirety of our traditional territories. So it's a very, very small portion of our homeland that was reserved for us, the Indian band. And I always found that funny. Like, is that the collective noun for Indians within the colonial vocabulary? Like a band of Indians, a murder of crows? I don't know. But anyway, so we have the imposed reserve system, we have the imposed governance system, and essentially the band council is a form of government that very much mimics the Canadian government style, where you have the elections, you have typically a group, depending on the size of the reserve. In our case, we have 9 councillors, or actually 8 councillors and 1 chief councillor. And so this is the band chief that we often hear about, which, is essentially a councillor who just has a tie-breaking responsibility within the affairs. And so this system of governance was forced upon our people, and our people had to adapt to it in order to survive. So I know there's been a lot of conflict between the hereditary government, our traditional governments, which were forced underground during the Prohibition era, in which these band councils emerged. But in the 1950s, the large parts of the potlatch ban, as well as the limits on raising funds for the land claims, was repealed. And so then we have the hereditary systems kind of come back up to the surface after existing underground for over 70 years. And so this basically led to a situation where we have 2 very distinct forms of government across many of our territories. And this was a very common situation for a lot of the peoples of so-called Canada, because, at the same time we faced the exact same sweeping legislation across the board, regardless of our distinct culture or governance. And so we have essentially, in this case, like I would say the hereditary chiefs almost acting in the role of the rebel, in the role of the, very much revolutionary type approach to Gitxsan life and governance, holding up the Ayoch, the Gitxsan law, holding up, the values and the protocols. And in this case, like, because that potlatch ban was repealed, by no means does that mean that the repression of our people ceased. And so then many of our people who were forced into the band council model of governance simply to survive the Prohibition era, were essentially put in a position where, okay, like, you're going to have to be in opposition to the hereditary governance system. And this, this exists to this day, this imposed oppositional dynamic. When we see stuff like the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which I think is the ultimate case study in these relationships, because within Canadian law, despite UNTRIP, any nation on whose territory, like, we have these project proposals, they do not have the right to say no. There is still no right to consent within British Columbia or within Canada as a whole. And often within the negotiations, the Crown negotiators and the corporate negotiators will often say, okay, well, this project's going to happen whether you like it or not. And so you might as well get something out of it. And so then that kind of leaves these band councils in a position where, okay, we could oppose this. We could have no funding for all of the important, issues that we're still trying to address within our community. And many of them, like legacies of colonization, the residential schools, like a lot of, intense work that needs to be done on reserve. Or, because it's going to happen anyway, we might as well sign on because every other band council is signed on, and at least we'll get something, even if it's, just a few relatively small cash payouts and, a few very low level employment opportunities within the project itself. And so that's like a bit of the dynamic that exists between the Crown, the corporations, and the band council. In the meantime, within like continuing with the example of Wet'suwet'en territory, we have the hereditary chiefs who entirely oppose this on the grounds that no, we do not simply have the 3 or 4% of our land that is the reserve, but the 100% of the land that we outlined, very clearly over and over again, and especially within the Supreme Court case of Delgamuukw versus the Crown. And, we're not going to risk ceding our inherent rights and title by allowing a foreign-owned corporation to acquire essentially what is land title across the entirety of our territory through a right-of-way, which would impact our ongoing land claims and negotiations, as well as destroy countless habitats and protected ecosystems within their culture. And there's a whole host of, very important strategic reasons why the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs oppose this project. But when it comes to the band council hereditary chief dynamics, one of the Giksan hereditary chiefs I look up to, Hanamuk, he puts it best because he says, this is very much a foreign-funded civil conflict that has been imposed within our people by the Crown. This is not something that is inherent to our people. And the best examples I can think of this is, within these agreements that are signed between the Crown, the band councils, and the corporations, there will often be clauses within those agreements that essentially say, okay, like the band council must quell any opposition to this project within its community. The band council, if any legal proceedings happen against the project, the band council must support the side of the corporation. And if any land claims are eventually to come to fruition, then like the band council will always be on the side of the corporation and the Crown. And I think for these agreements, like I am certain that none of the band councils signed them with the intention of going against the long ongoing land claims that their people are initiating through the hereditary chiefs. But as a result of signing these agreements, they've been pinned into a position where they are legally obligated to fight against the hereditary system, where they can be called upon at any time by Coastal GasLink to write up a smear article or write up, a statement condemning the actions of the hereditary chiefs. And we've seen examples of this over and over and over. And so I think, like I would just want to impress upon everyone, there is no inherent conflict within our people between the bands and the hereditary chiefs. That is very much an imposed conflict. And you can see how well that plays out within the Canadian consciousness, within the media. where it's a people divided. You have, like a few hereditary chiefs who oppose a project, which, everyone signed on to. And like you have, well, basically, they treat us like an insurgency. Like these are different cells that need to be managed and, addressed and suppressed. And yeah, I think it's this whole narrative of a divided people is very much a hostile communications tactic. That's the last thing I want to impress about that.
Colin, thank you for kind of giving us the context for some of these contemporary issues. But I'm wondering, speaking more about like the media's role in either perpetuating this idea of these like internal conflicts, but also like in your own work, like what role does the media play when it comes to your work, but also like the manipulation of perception of Indigenous peoples?
Well, I think there's a big reason why a lot of movements have really gravitated towards social media. Because quite often, like especially in the case of the Gixan or the Wet'suwet'en peoples, uh, a lot of what's happening, a lot of the breaking events are quite distant from any reporters who can actually record it. When you're 60 something kilometers out in the bush, if you're, out on a blockade, which is like past Kispiox, like it's actually very difficult to get any of the mainstream media out there. And, CBC or Global, I think there's a few more, but I haven't honestly paid any attention to them for the past while. Um, and so social media has become like our biggest strength because nowadays everyone has a phone, everyone has a recording device. You can get a GoPro quite easily, and you have to document everything because despite all these claims of the province and the RCMP about the rule of law, I think quite honestly, like you know in most cases we are the only lawful people on the ground, the people collecting evidence, the people bringing this to the public, the people actually telling the honest accounts and stories of what is happening and what the representatives of the Crown, the representatives of British Columbia, are engaging in on the ground, despite all their rhetoric in the legislature or in their own press releases. And so I think this kind of activist media has been hugely critical. And at the same time, there's been, some amazing reporters, amazing people who have been doing, work in webinars such as this one, and, working for outlets such as the Narwhal, I think it's Briar Patch. There was another one that's an animal, the walrus.
Maybe
And,
that the Tyee.
the Tyee, yes, the Tyee has been huge, and like there's some really amazing people and reporters who I've had the pleasure of meeting and talking to coming up to our territories, and yeah, and I've seen some amazing stories come out of that, and it's but yeah, overall it's been very difficult because we've seen kind of this communications warfare that's been employed by the Crown, which essentially has the vast majority of media outlets parroting the exact same statements. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've seen over and over repeated like a mantra: the Coastal GasLink project has the unprecedented support of all 20 elected First Nations along the pipeline route, with the opposition of some hereditary chiefs. Like, I can even recite it at this point. And, you'll see that paragraph in every CBC article. You'll see that in every press release by the province. You'll see that in every single press release by the RCMP. especially in every press release by Coastal GasLink or TC Energy or any of their partners. And they all toe the exact same line without any critical dialogue or critical thought in regards to, what that paragraph actually means. And I think that's, in my head, a part of the concerted communication strategy of diminishing the hereditary system, especially when it comes to this statement that only five hereditary chiefs oppose this project, or a small amount of hereditary chiefs oppose this project, which is clearly a twisting of the facts when, the vast majority of the publications, announcements, press releases, legal statements put out by the Wet'suwet'en people make it clear that this is the 5 clans. And the 5 clans represent the 13 houses. And the 13 houses each represent a whole multitude of hereditary chiefs. And, none of that is elaborated upon in these statements. But thankfully, we have the, I would say the ethical journalists who are actually interested in the truth of the story and, not interested in skewing it one way or another. And then we have just the very raw documentation of the front lines as posted on social media. And those two have been very critical in overcoming what is ultimately just this brutal, information curtain that I think has been imposed to ultimately keep most Canadians in ignorance of what's happening on the front lines.
Emily, I would invite one of your questions for Colin. But thank you for your response.
Colin, I guess the question along that lines of the division, I think, first of all, what you're saying is 100% absolutely true. That, I mean, when we're looking at these issues of like the Coastal GasLink pipeline and we're reporting at it through a colonial lens, we're going to keep getting colonial information. But hopefully, luckily you said we have like reporters that are interested in educating the Canadian public about the reality of the situation. One of the misconceptions that we have, I guess, is just that, or that I have had before I went up there myself, is that the Gitxsan population itself, or the Wet'suwet'en population, the community, is divided when it comes to these issues. You have like some people that are for it, some people that are against it. So it's impossible to really get a consensus. I was wondering, what's your sense in the Gitxsan community of opposition towards the Coastal GasLink pipeline?
Well, given all the work that we put into protecting our rights and title within the courts, the intensely emotionally, financially draining court cases that lasted, were some of the longest in Canadian history, given, I would say, the majority of the Gitxsan houses, which there are 60 plus houses, and that's also kind of a reference too of, how big our nation is. Given all that, like, I can't really speak on behalf of anyone else, but I can speak on, just the fact that, like, myself as a member of the Gitlutham Hetwit, as well as many of the people who I, know and confide in, like, when we look at the Coastal GasLink conflict, we see not a pipeline battle. Like, we see a much bigger battle that's been happening for a much longer time. And this pipeline being simply the latest tool for the dispossession of our territories. And, it's made even more complicated by the fact that, within our land claims proceedings, within the Delgamuukw-Gisdewa court case, the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, not the band councils, the hereditary chiefs, were co-plaintiffs. And ultimately, the land question, in regards to title, was never resolved within those court cases. So technically, they are still on the books. And so these court cases could reignite at any point, as long as all the original plaintiffs of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en people come together, organize, and decide to pursue them. And we could have like the historic Delgamuch Gizdewe 2, which might very well resolve a lot of these issues and probably become one of the, monumental cases of our modern history. And so the issue here is that when the Wet'suwet'en Band Council signed on, they essentially put themselves in a position where if we were to move forward with Delgamuch 2, that they would not be in support of the plaintiffs. Like, and this isn't their personal opinion, but legally, as obligated by these contracts that are signed with the Crown and with the with Coastal GasLink, they would essentially be put in the position of defendant alongside the Crown. And in order to maintain their interests and their agreements, they would be in a position where they would have to fight both the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en land claims within the courts to the wider territories. And so as a Gitxsan person, this is, a very unnerving prospect. And I'd say it's quite genius on the part of the Crown to create this trap that ultimately limits, how we can progress within the legal front. And, as Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en peoples, like, we have to come up with countermeasures for that. But it's all a part of the big picture too, because one of the tests that was outlined within the Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en court cases was the exclusive and prolonged occupation of territory. And so the important one is exclusive, because as soon as any parts of our territory are being ceded to international corporations and then handed over in the form of fee simple land, then we no longer exclusively occupy that territory. And so that essentially, that fails one of the tests for land claims, at least within the colonial system, because I want to make it clear too, like, I'm not the kind of person who will put all my eggs in justice through colonial court. And that could be a whole other topic of discussion, to talk about the flaws within the colonial legal process and how a entity that derives all of its authority from the Crown would be incapable of undermining said authority. That's, there's a catch-22 when it comes to justice within the Canadian legal system. But what I'm saying is, while we fight in every aspect to assert our sovereignty and our governance on the ground, like, this is still a part of the wider strategy to try to hold the Canadian law to account for its actions and to its own law. And so, just to wrap up that thought there, so if we cannot prove that we exclusively occupy the territory, if, even for example, like in the case of Coastal GasLink, like if they shut off access roads going back into the, harder to reach territories, these could all be used as arguments that, hey, look, you can't even access your territory, so what right do you have to say that you're even sovereign on that territory? And so we will never recognize your claims to those lands. And as co-plaintiffs, the Gitxsan people, we have the exact same corporation, TC Energy, planning to build the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline through our territory. So because of what's happening in Wet'suwet'en, we have a good idea of what to expect. And so, I highly doubt that we'll end up in the same position of the legal traps and the other traps that the Crown and the corporations will set to divide us and make us fight each other. But at the same time, anything that happens on Wet'suwet'en territory does impact us. It does impact our ongoing land claims. It does, ultimately lead to just really, really Gosh, I'm sometimes I'm at a loss for words, but it just does lead to hardship because it's not easy, being in the sights of a pretty brutal, colonizing empire. Um, but ultimately, like we do persevere, we do keep the fight going, and I think just to tie this into the media question, like these are the angles, these are the stories that I think really need to be explored. Like these are where we need the FOIs, these are where we need to see the internal communications, the strategizing that happens behind the scenes. And we can't just look at this pipeline as a pipeline, um, because on one level you do have like the immediate destruction, environmental devastation, and the violation of the territories that it's causing. But on a wider scale, you see a door opening. And I would say for the first time since the Delgamuukw court case, we're seeing our armor, which was the unextinguished rights and title, being penetrated. And this basically, yeah, in my opinion, opens the floodgates for all unceded peoples within British Columbia and Canada, where the Crown is exploring its legal mechanisms on how to infringe and violate our rights and title, and how to push the envelope to secure more economic certainty on our territories, to secure more access for mega projects, especially since it's going full forward with countless fossil fuel projects, especially on the West Coast. Despite like our so-called commitments to end emissions and to regulate the fugitive gases that we're putting into the atmosphere. Despite all that, you know, I think we can get into that whole topic maybe some other time too, just how the rhetoric of reconciliation and uh, and climate accountability are very similar. But ultimately, like we do have the floodgates opening in the bigger picture in Coastal GasLink, bigger than Coastal GasLink on Gixsan, Wet'suwet'en, and all nations territories. Like we do have to fight this crown strategy because at the end of the day, it's ultimately genocide. It's ultimately the erasure of our people, our governance, our way of life, our culture. Because our laws fundamentally state, like even before, whatever government system you subscribe to, our laws say, like, you have to protect the land. You have to protect the life of everything that the sun touches. And like these are laws that are thousands of years old that are described in detail in the stories that have our ancestors encountering, vast supernatural beings who basically instruct us in how we have to live in harmony with all the other life around us. And so like that's something I can't just disregard on a personal level. And so that's really why we have to address this threat, and that's really why I personally believe Coastal GasLink has to die, because it's only the beginning for a whole, just a whole lot of suffering that would be welcomed across all of our territories up here.
Thank you so much, Colin. That's like hard to hear. That's like heavy stuff, but it's real. It's real, real, real. And I'm glad we're talking about it. I have to head out. I think Arian's got one more question for you. Thank you so much for talking with me, and I hope to see you again on your territory sometime this summer. All
Yeah,
right.
you're always welcome.
Bye, Colin.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today, Colin. As we kind of as we near the end of our time together, if there was one takeaway you wanted youth to have from your experience, particularly as it relates to like youth who want to make a difference in combating climate change or supporting Indigenous rights and sovereignty, like what would that takeaway be for those youth interested in making a change?
I would say trust your gut, trust your heart, really trust those feelings you have, those reactions. Like at the end of the day, you really have to rely on your spirit, because that's what's going to guide you. That's what's going to show you what matters to you. And you could feel that as long as you open yourself up to those feelings. Um, like on Giksan territory, we have, like, we talk about that spirit, the Otsen. And, there's processes to get closer to that, which we call sisat, which are the cleansing practices. But ultimately, like, you need to trust yourself. Like, at any level, you need to believe in yourself. This whole fight can be very daunting. It could be very overwhelming. You could be just a guy sitting in a chair on a webinar, who has to go out the next day and confront like a crown with unlimited funding, with unlimited mercenaries, that has its sights set on something that you love, that is precious to you. Yet you still have to remain strong. You still have to believe in yourself. And at the end of the day, you can always rely on the people around you. I rely intensely on my elders, even the ones that have passed. Some of their words really lift me up, like Albert Tate, Delgamuch, the original Delgamuch during the court case. He said, "What do we have to fear? Because we have the truth behind us." And so that always kept me going. As long as I have the truth, I got nothing to fear. As long as I just speak the truth, then I'm invincible. And it really helps when you're going against a very untruthful foe. Because there will be nothing they can do to break your spirit. They can't break your spirit with lies. And so understand who you are. Understand where you come from. Understand your spirit and what you have to do, and walk in that truth. And you will be invincible, and you will find the like-minded people around you doing that similar work. Because you need friends. Yeah, I mean, that's my heartfelt advice. And you got this, because that's something that always heartens me too, is there's so many people out there on some very, very awesome trajectories in their work that will totally revolutionize, whatever we're struggling with right now. So we just got to keep building those connections. We just got to keep meeting, keep talking, keep organizing, and, keep these discussions, elevating them, evolving them, bringing them out to the people, to the community. And I think that's something very much we could do, because we're kind of, I would call this a Renaissance era. Like, if we could pull through this brutal dark age of colonial extraction, of people being pitted against one another, of just the warfare on the human rights, like, we're gonna see an unprecedented era of growth and hope and innovation. But we do have to push to get there, because right now it's still very status quo. The economic system that we live in is against innovation, is against upheaval, is against any type of uncertainty. And what we need right now is a total upheaval. We need innovation. We need revolutionary ideas that could pull us through the climate crisis, that can address the countless needs of our communities on the ground level. And yeah, like, we need the movers and the shakers. And there's people working on that. So yeah, I guess just on a final note, walk with the truth, and yeah, I think you'll do good. You'll do good.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words, Colin. What's next for you? Like, where can people kind of stay in touch and continue to support the work that you're doing?
I'll be on Gixan territory, specifically working on the Gitlu from Hetwit territories. And you could find me on social media, Gitlu from Hetwit Media. I could send the spelling for that afterwards. And yeah, it's like we'll be sharing any updates, any ongoings up there. Hopefully, more critical conversations. I think, eventually we're hoping to get a podcast going where we could just invite some theorists and land defenders just to totally dive into the muck and the dirtiness of the act of consultation of basically the big things that we're dealing with right now. Yeah, you could get loose from Hetwit Media, give us a follow, check me out on Instagram too, Sutherland-Wilson. It's a little less serious. I just got mainly, it's probably going to be a lot of puppy and baby pictures. It's always uplifting.
Yeah, well, thank you, Colin, so much for your time and for sharing your experience with all of our audience today. Maybe we will see you on your next podcast in the future, but we just want to wish you the best. And thanks again for coming and talk with us today.
All right. Thank you very much.
Take care. Wow. What an incredible episode to be able to draw so much insight from. Thank you again to Colin, and looking to our own future. This week is our last episode 6 of Coastal Insights Season 3 on sustaining hope. And so despite the overwhelming challenges facing youth, there are numerous and rich examples of youth leading change at the community, national, and international levels. And so in our next webinar, our hosts will discuss with youth movement leaders to find out what inspired them to make change and what drives them for the long haul. Some positive changes from the past year will be highlighted, and our hosts and guests will share their own opinions on what kinds of leaders, businesses, and careers are needed most for the future. And so, like Colin said, we need the movers and the shakers, and we know that's you in our audience watching. We want to hear your voice and your truth in the Raincoast and Take a Stand Youth for Conservation Student Innovation Challenge. More information can be found at this link. But we are looking to showcase the many inspiring youth-led projects that promote education, stewardship, and conservation of the local wildlife habitats and Indigenous cultures of coastal British Columbia and the transboundary Pacific Northwest. Your project will be featured in our virtual event that will bring together inspiring youth doing incredible work in their communities and a rich network of professionals working to protect and sustain nature. The deadline to submit your project is May 27th and can look like any number of forms ranging from a video to a presentation to other forms of creative expression. Again, more information can be found at www.raincoast.org/innovation challenge. So we hope to see your story there and to support the next generation of change makers through art and film. I've been one of your co-hosts, Arian Tomar, and thank you for tuning in. Take care now.